Hello and welcome. Today we're doing a bit of a different setup. I wanted to mix things up a little bit. I felt like the setup I had before, it was just B-roll and my voice was getting a bit repetitive. So I'm going to try this out now. Let me know what you think. So today we're having a look at two lenses, the Canon EF-S 24mm f2.8 and the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 for Canon. So in terms of size, the Canon measures 68.2 by 22.8mm or 2.69 by 0.9 inches and weighs 125 grams or 4.41 ounces. The Yongnuo measures 73 by 55mm or 2.87 by 2.17 inches and weighs 120 grams or 4.2 ounces. Clearly the 24mm lens is significantly smaller than the Yongnuo. Now, in terms of build, both are okay. However, the Yongnuo has a plastic mount, whereas the Canon lens has a metal mount, which gives it a pretty massive advantage in terms of build. So I'd say that the 24mm lens is significantly more pro, or it feels more pro. Next up, focal length and aperture. What we're really talking about here, especially when we're talking about aperture, is how much light the lens allows to reach the sensor. Now, the Canon lens has an aperture of f2.8, whereas the Yongnuo lens has an aperture of f1.8. The lower number, rather counterintuitively, means that it can open wider, and thus it can allow more light in. This is fantastic when you are working with low light. So a lot of the times you'll be shooting outside, is quite late, or you're shooting in an environment where there just isn't a lot of light. Like in this room, for example, this room's quite dark and I have to have multiple lights, and my lens, which is the RF 15 to 35mm lens, is actually set to f2.8, which is the widest they can open. When you're dealing with the exposure triangle, which is aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, you can have better settings in terms of ISO and shutter speed. So for example, right now I'm at f2.8, 1/50 shutter speed, because I'm shooting this. I just realized that was in the background the entire time. So I'm at 1/50 shutter speed and I'm at 500 ISO. So normally you want to keep your ISO as low as possible, and your shutter speed depends on what you're doing. So for example, because I'm on a tripod, I'm doing video, I want to effectively double my shutter speed in terms of, you look at your FPS and you double that, and that's what your shutter speed should be. Does that make any sense? I hope so. Next up is focal length. Now, focal length is the number of millimeters in the name of the lens. The Yongnuo has 50mm, the Canon has 24. This tells us a few things. So first of all, it tells us that both lenses are prime, which means that they can't be zoomed in and out. It's just the static number. This has advantages and disadvantages. So the main advantage of a prime lens is that it's going to be sharper compared to a variable lens. In terms of what the numbers mean, 24 just means that the lens is more zoomed out, whereas 50mm means that the lens is more zoomed in. Now this again has advantages and disadvantages. We're going to discuss these a bit later on in the review though. However, one thing I'll say right now is that if you want to do portraits, the 50mm has a massive advantage, and the reason why is because your focal length is going to cause different levels of distortion. So if I were to film myself with a different lens and compensate for the distance by going further or closer, my facial characteristics will look slightly different. And 50mm is closer to the 85mm focal length, which is considered to be the golden standard for portraits. So the 50mm has an advantage in that sense. Right, next up, image quality. What can these lenses do? What kind of photos can they produce, and what kind of issues do they have? So the first thing I want to talk about is vignetting. Vignetting is when you get the sort of dark edges. Whether vignetting is a problem or not is debatable. Some people say it is. I personally quite like a bit of vignetting in my photos. It's up to you. Next up, IS. Do they have IS? Nope. Neither of them have IS, which is, honestly, that's kind of a rare feature to have on like sort of more budget lenses. The one notable exception being the Canon EF-S 18 to 55mm kit lens, which does have IS. Also, a lot more expensive lenses can have it. So for example, my 15 to 35mm lens that I'm filming this on is also what I use to film pretty much all of my B-roll now. So this has IS. It works beautifully. I shoot it on the Canon R5. That is very, also has built-in IBIS. So when combined, you get some really stable footage, especially if it's also slowed down. It gets really stable and really smooth. What about autofocus? So the Canon lens has the STM motor, whereas the Yongnuo has basically Canon's DC motor. So the STM motor stands for stepper motor. STM is usually found on more affordable lenses, but it's also quite smooth and quiet, so it's actually quite a good pick for video. I don't know that I'd use this lens for video necessarily, but the STM does help with that. Now, the Yongnuo's autofocus it's not great. It's rather slow, kind of struggles to find focus, and when it does, it can lose it quite quickly. It's quite noisy when it hunts for focus. So the Canon definitely has the far better autofocus. Now, because of this, the Yongnuo lens is not recommended for subjects that move quite fast, so I wouldn't recommend it for sports, wildlife. You wouldn't really use a 50mm lens for that necessarily because it's not quite zoomed in enough as it is, but if you're trying to take photos of things or people that move really fast, the Yongnuo's autofocus will cause problems, so I wouldn't recommend that. Next up, minimum focusing distance. Now, minimum focusing distance is, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but when you try and take a photo of something, you're getting closer and closer and closer. You're going to notice that at some point, the lens just refuses to focus. Now, this is because you have exceeded the minimum focusing distance. You got too close. Each lens has a certain number. For the Canon lens, it's 16 centimeters or 6.3 inches. And for the Yongnuo, it's 45 centimeters or 17.72 inches. So basically, if you get closer than that, you're not going to be able to get in focus. Now, what about sharpness? Man, this chair it's really loud. I hope you can't hear that. Be really funny if you do. So the Canon lens is sharper than the Yongnuo. This doesn't surprise anyone. However, both lenses are mostly just sharper in the center, and as you get towards the edges of the frame, right here, as you get towards the edges, you get less sharpness. This is pretty typical for a more affordable lens, whereas the one that I'm shooting on here is actually pretty evenly sharp across the frame. This isn't something that most people will notice, but it's worth mentioning. Now, before we move on to vlogging, I want to address chromatic aberration. So both of these lenses exhibit some of it. Chromatic aberration is this weird sort of fringing effect that happens in low light, so typically around evening time or really early morning. When you have straight lines and not enough light, you get this almost sort of color bleed like thing that happens on the edges. Photographers tend to be pretty picky about it. I don't mind it. I think that a bit of chromatic aberration can actually look kind of cool. I think it's more of a psychological thing where photographers know that it's technically a flaw in the lens, even though basically every lens has some, even the one that I'm shooting on still has some chromatic aberration. If you're taking photos for other photographers to see, they will mind. However, if you're taking photos for normal people to enjoy, then people aren't going to notice. Like, no one's going to notice the chromatic aberration, and I don't think it's that much of a problem, though it is worth mentioning. Next up, vlogging. So this is actually very interesting because the Yongnuo has the advantage of letting in more light, which is great when you're vlogging. However, at 50mm, that's way too zoomed in. As an example, right now I'm shooting at 24mm on my lens. It is roughly about as far as it would be if I was holding my arm outstretched with a Gorilla Pod, and this is what you're seeing at 24. So if I was doing this at 50, I mean, this is 35. 50mm, as you can see on screen right now, is just far too zoomed in. It's not really practical for vlogging unless you want to set your camera down and take a few steps back. It's up to you. I wouldn't really use it for vlogging. In regards to the Canon, you can use it for vlogging. People have done so. The f2.8 is more than enough. It'll give you more than enough light during the day for vlogging. The problem though, and this is why I wouldn't recommend it for vlogging, is that it doesn't have any IS, or image stabilization. As you can see on screen, the image is going to be quite shaky. Now, this can be advantageous if it suits the style of your vlog, if you're doing something very sporty or very sort of high-paced. However, for most people, I think that the 24mm lens is just too shaky. If you want an affordable recommendation, I would look at the Canon EF-S 18 to 55mm kit lens. It's an entry-level lens. It's not the best lens in the world, but it's wide, and you can zoom in if you need to. You're probably going to zoom into around 24mm, and you have IS, which is fantastic. However, the minimum aperture is f3.5, That's kind of a problem because that doesn't let in as much light as the f2.8. Still, it is usable for vlogging, especially during daytime, but you're going to run into lighting issues if you're vlogging indoors or if you're vlogging towards the end of the day. So bear that in mind. Next up, how about for YouTube? They're actually both good for YouTube. I would absolutely choose the 50mm for this, purely because of the f1.8. So basically you can just set your tripod a bit further away. You're going to let in a lot of light because of the f1.8, and you're going to have nice blurry background. So if you look at my background, I'm at f2.8 and the background is fairly blurry. It's not too far away. You're going to get more blur if you're doing f1.8. So bear that in mind. However, before we move on, I'd say don't move too much. Like my R5 with the RF lens is doing a really good job of holding focus. If you're shooting on the Yongnuo, maybe with a entry-level DSLR like a 77D or something, or a Rebel camera, it might struggle to keep you in focus, so just bear that in mind. That could be a problem. So before we move on, if you're finding this video to be informative, if it's fun, make sure to leave a like. It helps the channel, it really does. And also, if you want to check out any of the products I've mentioned in this video, I have affiliate links down below. You can check those out. And now, back to the video. So in terms of control, it's pretty basic. Obviously both lenses have a manual focus ring. It's pretty good. Neither of them are too smooth. The Canon one's better. Also, because they're prime lenses, you don't have a zoom ring. So in terms of compatibility, this is where it gets quite interesting. So the Yongnuo has an EF mount, which means that it can actually work both on EF and EF/EF-S cameras. This includes pretty much the majority of Canon's cameras, especially the budget ones. The Canon lens, though, has an EF-S mount, so that means that it only really works on crop sensor cameras like the Canon 77D and the Rebel series, but not the full-frame 6D, for example. By the way, I've actually reviewed quite a lot of cameras on my channel. If you want to check that out, there's a card somewhere here. Not sure. I'm sure you'll see it. Next up, longevity. So the first thing you want to look at in terms of longevity is whether you have weather sealing. Neither the Canon nor the Yongnuo lens does. Obviously they are very budget, so you're not going to have that. The next thing you want to look at is whether they have a plastic mount or a metal mount, because of course a metal mount is going to be stronger, it's going to last for longer. The Canon lens does have a metal mount, the Yongnuo lens, plastic mount. Now, when it comes to more expensive lenses like this one or my Canon RF 85mm f1.2, you want to protect them. I personally like to use a UV filter. I bought a Sigma ceramic UV filter the moment I got the lenses. I put them on. Now, there are pros and cons. Some people say that there is a slight image degradation if you have a UV lens on. I don't care. I don't think it's anywhere near significant enough for that to matter. Some people just prefer to use lens hoods. That's fine. I don't. I like to not have too much stuff. And of course, lens hoods, they're pretty big. Look at the lens hood for my RF 85mm. Yeah, takes space. Even if you invert it, it just makes the lens wider and bigger. I don't like that. I just use UV filters. If you do want to get a filter for either of these lenses, their filter size is 52mm. Again, I wouldn't recommend it, especially as the UV filters that you will get for these will be cheaper. Not great. They might degrade the image even further. I just get a lens hood or not use anything. The lens hood for the 24mm is actually very, very tiny, by the way. Whew, right, we made it. We made it for the video. Now, I quite enjoyed doing this sort of video. I quite missed sort of filming myself and doing this. These videos aren't scripted, obviously. The ones that I did before were. These aren't, they're more off the cuff. I quite prefer doing it this way, but I want to know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments down below. Should I keep doing these? Should I go back to the previous system? Let me know. Also, as you know, channel, YouTube, loads of videos, lenses, cameras. I've revamped my website. Go on there, there's a lot of stuff on there. I'm going to post a lot of tutorials and a lot of cool stuff, so check that out if you are a big fan of reading. Ooh, look at me, I'm a nerd.